The 6 psychological stages a narcissist may experience when they lose someone are far more complex than most people realize. But before we begin, it is important to understand one thing. The word stages can make it sound like there is a perfect order, like a straight path where one thing happens after another in a predictable way. Human psychology rarely works that neatly. And when it comes to narcissistic patterns, the process is even more complicated. So when we talk about stages, we are not talking about a fixed timeline that happens the same way every single time. We are talking about a series of internal, emotional, and psychological reactions that can happen after a significant loss. Sometimes these reactions appear quickly. Sometimes they develop over weeks or even months. Sometimes a person may move backward and forward between different reactions depending on what is happening around them. They may even experience several of these reactions at the same time, creating behavior that looks confusing and unpredictable from the outside. But underneath that confusion, there is usually a pattern. There is a psychological process taking place beneath the surface, and understanding that process can help explain the behaviors you may have already witnessed or the behaviors you may currently be observing from a distance. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand narcissistic behavior is focusing only on what is visible. They focus on the actions, they focus on the messages, the sudden changes, the attempts to reconnect, the public image they create, the way they talk about the relationship afterward, or the way they appear to move on quickly. But behavior is only the outer layer. Behind those actions is a deeper psychological system, a system built around protecting self-image, avoiding painful emotions, maintaining control, and defending against feelings that are difficult for the person to process. And once you understand what is happening beneath the surface, many behaviors that once seemed impossible to understand start making more sense. The first stage is often the one that surprises people the most because it is usually not what they expect. Most people expect anger first. They expect immediate revenge, obvious hostility, a public attack, or an instant replacement with someone new. Sometimes those things do happen, but often they are not the first reaction. The first reaction is usually something much quieter. It often looks like complete indifference. After losing someone who played a major role in their emotional world, someone whose attention, presence, validation, and investment became part of their daily experience, the narcissist may appear strangely calm, almost too calm. They may continue their normal routine. They may post online as if nothing happened. They may interact with others casually. They may talk about the end of the relationship as if it was insignificant. They may appear completely unaffected by the loss. And for the person who walked away, watching this from a distance can feel deeply painful. It can create the feeling that maybe the relationship never mattered. Maybe the connection was never real. Maybe all the time, effort, and emotional energy you invested meant nothing. Maybe you were easily replaceable. But what appears to be calm on the outside may not actually be calm on the inside. What appears to be indifference may not actually be a lack of feeling. Instead, what may be happening is a powerful psychological defense mechanism activating in response to a painful threat. The mind begins protecting itself. One of the ways this protection can happen is through devaluation. The person begins reducing the emotional importance of what they lost. They start changing the internal story about the relationship so the loss feels less threatening. The mind begins creating a version of reality where the relationship was not as meaningful, the connection was not as important, and the person who left was not as valuable as they truly were. This does not necessarily happen as a conscious decision. It is not always a person sitting down and intentionally deciding to pretend they do not care. In many cases, it is an automatic defense. It is the mind attempting to reduce emotional pain before that pain becomes overwhelming. Instead of fully experiencing the loss, the person may try to convince themselves that there was nothing significant to lose. Instead of facing the emptiness created by someone's absence, they may try to erase the importance of that person in their own mind. The relationship is rewritten internally. The memories are filtered. The meaning of what happened begins changing. And this is why the first stage can be so confusing for the person who is left behind. They are watching someone appear completely unaffected, while they themselves may be struggling with the emotional impact of the ending. But the outside appearance does not always reveal the internal reality. The second stage begins when that protective story starts becoming harder to maintain. At some point, reality begins breaking through the version of events the narcissist created to protect themselves. This usually happens because of absence. Not just the absence of obvious things like attention, praise, or emotional support, but the absence of the small personal things that often go unnoticed until they disappear. The little details, the way you understood their moods, the way you knew what they needed without them explaining it, the way you remembered their habits, the way you responded to their stories, the way you provided a familiar source of comfort, attention, and emotional energy. These things become part of someone's everyday life so gradually that they may not recognize their importance while they are still receiving them. But when that person is gone, the empty spaces become noticeable. The quiet moments become different. The daily routines feel different. The small reminders of that person's presence begin appearing everywhere. And this is when the reality of the loss can begin to create discomfort. The person who once convinced themselves that the relationship was not important begins encountering evidence that it actually had an impact. The absence becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the second stage begins. A feeling of internal panic may start developing. Not always visible panic. Not the kind of panic where someone openly admits fear, sadness, or regret. Because for someone who struggles deeply with vulnerability, showing those emotions may feel threatening. Instead, it may appear internally as confusion, restlessness, curiosity, or a sudden need to know what is happening with the person who left. The person begins realizing that the situation may not be as controllable as they first believed. The loss they dismissed begins feeling more real. The emotional gap becomes noticeable. And this is often where the urge to reconnect begins forming. This is where the desire to check, monitor, or gather information may appear. They may look at social media more often. They may pay closer attention to updates. They may ask mutual friends questions that seem casual but are actually attempts to collect information. Are they doing okay? Are they moving on? Are they seeing someone else? Do they seem happier without me? These questions are not always coming from genuine love or emotional understanding. Sometimes they come from a need to understand the situation and regain a sense of control. It is similar to repeatedly checking something that has caused pain. Not because the person is ready to heal from it, but because they want to measure how serious the situation has become. They want to know how much has changed. They want to know whether the person they lost is truly gone. And what they discover during this stage can often trigger the next reaction. A reaction that is much more visible. A reaction that many people recognize immediately. Anger. And this anger is not always the same as normal anger after a painful breakup. It can be different in its intensity, its purpose, and the way it is directed. It is not simply the sadness of losing someone. It is not just heartbreak searching for an outlet. It can become a reaction to feeling injured, rejected, or powerless. The person may feel that their image, control, or sense of importance has been threatened, and when that happens, the pain may be expressed outwardly as aggression. This is where the next phase begins to reveal itself. A narcissist who is truly destabilized is not just someone who is angry. They are someone who has been affected more deeply than they ever wanted to admit. They cared more than they planned to, they lost more than they expected to, and now they are destroying everything around them because they cannot face the evidence of how much that loss actually affected them. This is why the rage of stage 3, even though it can be extremely painful for the person experiencing it from the other side, is also one of the most revealing moments in the entire process. It is one of the closest things to honest communication that the narcissist has shown since the relationship ended. Behind the anger, behind the accusations, behind the attempts to rewrite the story and make themselves look like the victim, there is a message they would almost never admit directly. The message is that you mattered. The message is that the loss had an impact. The message is that the confidence and indifference they displayed at the beginning were not as real as they appeared. The performance of not caring was exactly that, a performance. And when the rage eventually burns itself out, when the arguments stop, when the attempts to control the story become exhausting, something else begins to appear underneath, something quieter, something harder for the narcissist to avoid. This is where the next stages begin. And these stages are the ones that explain why some people continue to feel connected to this dynamic long after the relationship has ended. Because what happens after the rage disappears is not another dramatic explosion, it is silence. But this silence is completely different from the silence of the first stage. The silence in the beginning was intentional. It was created. It was carefully maintained. It was a way for the narcissist to convince themselves and everyone around them that they were unaffected. It was a protective wall, a way to avoid feeling the full emotional weight of what had happened. But the silence after the rage is different. This silence is not planned. It is what remains after the energy required to maintain anger finally runs out. There is no longer a new argument to create. There is no longer another person to blame. There is no longer another version of the story to build. The distractions become less effective, the performance becomes harder to maintain. And when all of that disappears, the narcissist is left with something they have been trying to avoid from the beginning: the emptiness created by the loss. This is where stage 4 begins. And stage 4 is often the stage that people on the outside would never recognize because it does not look the way they expect. From the outside, it may appear that the narcissist has finally moved on. It may look like they have completely adjusted to their new life. They may appear confident, happy, and completely unaffected. They may show everyone that they are doing better than ever. But internally, in the quiet moments when there is no audience and no one to impress, something very different can be happening. Stage 4 is the closest thing to genuine grief that a narcissistic personality structure may experience. But it is not the same type of grief that most people understand. It is grief that cannot easily be acknowledged. It cannot be openly expressed. It cannot be processed in the healthy ways that allow people to truly heal. Because admitting grief means admitting that something was lost. And admitting that something was lost means admitting that something mattered. That is the part that creates the conflict. The entire defense system of a narcissist is often built around the belief that nobody and nothing should have power over them unless they personally choose to allow it. To admit that another person had real value, real importance, and real emotional impact can feel like a threat to the identity they have created. So the grief remains hidden. It stays buried inside a person who does not have the emotional tools or the willingness to fully process it. And because it cannot be recognized for what it is, it often appears in other forms. It appears as irritation, restlessness, a constant feeling that something is wrong, a dissatisfaction with their current life that they cannot explain. They may feel frustrated, bored, or unhappy, but they struggle to identify the real source of those emotions. Because finding the source would require a level of honesty and self-reflection that they may have spent years avoiding. This is also the stage where a replacement relationship, if one was created earlier, begins to show its limitations. At first, the new person may seem like the perfect solution. The new relationship may bring excitement, attention, admiration, and validation. It may temporarily fill the space that was left behind. But there is a difference between filling a space and actually healing what created that space. The new person may provide attention, they may provide comfort, they may provide admiration, but they cannot recreate the exact connection that existed before. Because they were not chosen based on deep emotional understanding. They were often chosen because they were available, because they provided reassurance, because they fit the role that became empty after the previous relationship ended. The relationship provides stimulation, but it does not provide true emotional satisfaction. It fills the immediate need, but it does not solve the deeper problem. And eventually, the narcissist begins to experience the same frustration that appeared in previous relationships. The new person cannot fix the feeling they cannot identify. So the frustration begins to move outward. The closest person becomes the target. The same pattern starts repeating. The same cycle begins again. Idealization, attachment, frustration, devaluation, distance, and eventually another loss. But stage 4 has something different that previous cycles did not have. There is now a memory in the background, the memory of the person who truly saw them, the person who noticed things others ignored, the person who understood them beyond the surface. That memory becomes something they cannot easily recreate. The new relationship may work on the outside, but internally it may feel different. The attention may feel less satisfying. The connection may feel less meaningful. The performance may require more effort because somewhere in the background is the awareness of what existed before. And that awareness creates a discomfort they cannot fully explain. This is where stage 5 begins. Stage 5 begins when the narcissist decides they need to do something about that feeling. And usually that action takes one familiar form. they attempt to reconnect, not always directly. Sometimes it happens through another person. A mutual friend may suddenly become a connection point. Someone who has been quietly observing or passing information between both sides may become a way to test the situation. Sometimes it happens through social media, a carefully timed reaction, a small interaction, a message designed to appear casual and accidental, but underneath it is a question. Is the door still open? Is access still possible? Is the person still emotionally available? Has enough time passed for the pain to become weaker? Has the clarity they gained after leaving become softer? The attempt is not always obvious. Sometimes it is disguised as concern. Sometimes it appears as vulnerability. Sometimes it looks like regret. But often, the deeper motivation is the desire to reconnect with what they lost. This is the return of the pattern that began earlier, the attempt to pull the person back into the emotional space they once occupied. And when the narcissist returns, they usually do not return as the person you saw at the end. They return as the person from the beginning, the warm version, the caring version, the version who made you feel chosen, the version who made you believe you had found something rare. The charm returns, the attention returns, the affection returns, the same qualities that created the original bond become active again. And in that moment, it can feel incredibly convincing, because the narcissist may genuinely want something. They may genuinely miss what you provided. They may genuinely feel the absence of your presence. But wanting something back is not the same as being capable of changing. This is what makes stage 5 so confusing and so difficult for many people, because the person returning may not appear fake. They may sound sincere. They may seem emotional. They may appear to finally understand what they lost. And for someone who truly loved them, that moment can create a powerful conflict. Because the memories are still there. The good moments were real. The connection you felt was real. The feelings you experienced were real. And when someone returns showing the same qualities that made you fall for them in the beginning, it can awaken the part of you that remembers the relationship before the pain began. This is why stage 5 can be the most dangerous stage for the person on the receiving end. Not because every action is always intentionally planned, or because every word is always a calculated manipulation. The danger comes from the fact that the return reaches directly into the space between healing and longing, the space between who you are becoming without them and who you were when you were connected to them, the space between the clarity you gained after distance and the emotional memory of what the relationship once felt like. That space exists because you cared. It exists because you invested. It exists because your emotions were genuine. It is not proof that you failed to heal. It is proof that something meaningful existed on your side. Real attachment does not disappear simply because a relationship becomes unhealthy. The human mind does not erase years of connection overnight. The nervous system remembers comfort. It remembers routines. It remembers the moments when things felt safe. And that is exactly why the return can feel so powerful. The narcissist understands this because they knew you closely. They knew what made you feel loved. They knew what words reached you. They knew what version of themselves created the strongest bond. And when they return, they often return with that knowledge. But the important difference is this: a person can miss what you gave them without being ready to become the person you needed them to be. A person can regret losing access to you without truly understanding the damage they caused. A person can want the relationship back without having the ability to create a healthier version of that relationship. Wanting the old connection is not the same as building something new. And that difference is where many people become trapped, because they are not only responding to the person standing in front of them, they are responding to the memory of who that person used to be. They are responding to the hope that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they finally understand. Maybe this time they finally see the pain they caused. And sometimes the strongest emotional pull comes not from the reality of the relationship, but from the possibility of what the relationship could have been. This is why stage 5 requires so much awareness, because the question is not only whether they came back. The real question is why they came back. Did they return because they developed the ability to create something healthier? Or did they return because they felt the absence of what you provided? Those two things can look almost identical from the outside, but they lead to completely different outcomes. Then comes stage 6, the final stage. And this is the stage that often takes the longest to understand because it does not look like a stage at all. There is no dramatic confrontation. There is no obvious collapse. There is no visible sign that something is happening internally. From the outside, it simply looks like the narcissist continued living. They move forward. They enter new relationships. They create new experiences. They build a life that appears untouched by your absence. And when you see that, it can create one of the most painful thoughts. Maybe you were wrong. Maybe they really did not care. Maybe everything you believed about the impact you had was only something you needed to believe in order to heal. But stage 6 is not the narcissist proving that they were unaffected. Stage 6 is the narcissist adapting to the loss in the only way their psychology allows, not through deep healing, not through honest self-examination, not through accepting responsibility and transforming themselves. Instead, they build around the loss. They create a life around the empty space. They continue moving, but the missing piece becomes part of the structure they build afterward. It influences their choices. It influences the type of people they are drawn toward. It influences what they search for in future relationships. They may not consciously understand what they are looking for. They may never openly admit it. But something about that previous connection becomes a reference point, a moment they compare other experiences against, not necessarily because they want the person back in a healthy sense, not necessarily because they suddenly become capable of love in the way they were unable to show before, but because some experiences leave a lasting impression. Some people create a level of emotional impact that cannot simply be replaced by finding someone new, the person who saw them clearly, the person who understood their hidden sides, the person who offered genuine emotional depth. That kind of connection can become something they remember, even if they cannot fully understand why it mattered. This does not mean the narcissist changes. It does not mean they suddenly become the person you hoped they would become. It does not mean they finally developed the emotional awareness needed to repair what they destroyed. It means something different. It means the experience becomes part of their internal world, a reference point, a memory, a quiet reminder of something they once had and could not maintain. This is why some people leave relationships with narcissists feeling like they were erased. They watch the other person continue their life, they see pictures, they see new relationships, they see appearances of happiness, and they wonder how someone could move forward so easily after causing so much pain. But appearances do not always reveal what is happening underneath. Moving on is not always the same as processing. Continuing is not always the same as healing. A person can build a new life without ever truly understanding the destruction created in the old one. The narcissist does not necessarily recover from the loss, they reorganize around it. They create a new version of life that includes the fact that they lost something important. And that difference matters because true healing requires facing reality. It requires accepting uncomfortable truths. It requires looking honestly at your own actions. It requires understanding the impact you had on another person. Without that process, the person may continue moving, but they are still carrying the unresolved patterns that created the loss in the first place. And somewhere beneath the distractions, beneath the new relationships, beneath the constant search for attention and validation, there can remain a question they never fully allow themselves to answer. What would have happened if they had been capable of being different? What would have happened if they had valued what they had before losing it? What would have happened if they had chosen honesty instead of control? That question may never be spoken. It may never be admitted. It may never even become fully conscious. But unanswered questions do not always disappear. Sometimes they remain quietly in the background, not as dramatic regret, not as an obvious confession, but as a feeling that something important was lost, something that cannot be perfectly recreated, something that cannot simply be replaced. And that is the true cost of losing someone who genuinely saw them, genuinely cared, and genuinely offered something real. Not that they suddenly become a different person, not that they finally understand everything, but that they have to continue living with the reality that they lost something valuable, something they may never fully understand, something they may never fully recover, and that is the part they cannot escape. The person they lost becomes a reminder of what they were unable to protect, a reminder of the connection they could not maintain, a reminder of the version of themselves they refused to become. And even as they continue forward, even as they create new stories and new relationships, that loss remains somewhere in the background. Quiet, unspoken, unresolved. Because some people are not remembered because they stayed. Some people are remembered because they left a mark that could not be erased.